Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Hillel Neuer. I'm the Executive Director of United Nations Watch. On behalf of the 25 NGOs cross-regional coalition that is co-sponsoring today's event, welcome to the 10th Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy. It's a milestone for us to mark 10 years of bringing human rights heroes from around the world to bear witness to what is happening in their countries 1 week before the United Nations opens its annual session of the Human Rights Council, where it is obliged to address urgent situations of human rights abuse and to take action and to make recommendations and to adopt resolutions. And we also mark another anniversary. We mark the 70th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Indeed, it was 7 decades ago, in the aftermath of the Nazi atrocities, that Eleanor Roosevelt, René Cassin, and other eminent figures gathered here on the banks of Lake Geneva to reaffirm the principle of human dignity. They created the Commission on Human Rights, and they adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which remains a beacon for dissidents around the world, including those who are about to speak today. Now, over time, this commission changed, today known as the Council. It became a body of governments and not eminent idealists. Too often, these governments are dictatorships and serial violators of human rights. Today, sadly, the Human Rights Council includes not only a number of democracies, but also dictatorships and non-democracies, including China, including Iraq, including the Democratic Republic of Congo, including Venezuela, including Cuba, including Pakistan, and other countries. And what I think we can do today is we have an opportunity to imagine. We have an opportunity to imagine what would the world be like, what would the United Nations be like if we were back in 1948, when those leading the Human Rights Commission represented the anti-Hitler alliance, when the founding chair of the Commission on Human Rights was Eleanor Roosevelt, who with her husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, fought Hitler and won, and when the vice chair was René Cassin, the great French legal philosopher who was with de Gaulle, resisting, refusing to collaborate. What if the members of the Human Rights Council today included such eminent idealists and not the regimes that oppress them? Today, we have the right, we have the opportunity to imagine. And I think today we can ask the question, when we think about China, why is China a member of the Human Rights Council when more than 1.3 billion people are denied any form of basic human rights, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and when human rights defenders like Yang Jianli and like Mr. Lam, who dared to speak out for democracy, were suddenly abducted, arrested, put in prison, in solitary confinement. And I think we have the right today to ask, what if instead of the Communist Party of China sitting on the Human Rights Council, instead we had human rights heroes like Yang Jianli, from whom we'll hear soon, and from Mr. Lam, the bookseller from Hong Kong, who dared to sell banned books and for that was abducted and found himself in detention, and yet he managed to get out, and he'll be with us here today. And we have the right to ask, why is Iraq on the Human Rights Council when that country violates human rights? And today, we can imagine, what if we had people like Farida Abbas Khalaf, someone who was victimized in the worst way, abused by ISIS, and yet today she stands tall. She wrote a book about it. She travels the world. She speaks out for her people, the Yazidi people. And she's courageous, and we'll hear from her soon today. And we have the right to ask, why is the Democratic Republic of Congo just been elected to the Human Rights Council, even after the case was made on how they abuse human rights? And we've seen protesters being killed in the past few days, and Mr. Kabila refuses to give up power in violation of the Constitution. And it's a country that is neither democratic nor republic. And today we have the right to imagine, what if instead of Kabila representing his country on the Human Rights Council, we had human rights heroes like Madame Julienne Lusenge, who will receive our Women's Rights Award later today, who for 2 decades has stood up when her country has become the rape capital of the world. She stood up to fight for women's rights, to fight against sexual violence, to speak out for children, creating a network of 40 women's groups, people who've been attacked with axes in their head, and she continues to fight. And what if Julienne Lusenge was sitting on the Human Rights Council with the nameplate of Democratic Republic of Congo? And we have the right to ask, why is the Maduro regime of Venezuela once again and again re-elected to the Human Rights Council after they have completely violated the human rights of their people, when the New York Times reports that babies are coming to hospitals around the country starving, and the country that has killed more than 130 protesters in the past year and threw opposition leaders in prison like Mr. Antonio Ledesma, the democratically elected mayor of Caracas, brutally and violently arrested from his office, taken to prison, held under house arrest, arrested, in prison, back and forth. He escaped a few months ago. We heard here from his daughter Antonietta, and now we'll get to hear from him. And we have the right to ask, we have the right to imagine, what if instead of the dictatorship of the Maduro regime, which is destroying the country, instead of them representing Venezuela at the United Nations, we had human rights heroes and idealists like Mayor Antonio Ledesma. And today we have the right to imagine that. And repeatedly again here in Geneva, year after year, the communist regime in Cuba continues to be elected at the Human Rights Council. They are one of the most active members, introducing, I believe, more resolutions than any other to shield dictatorships, to corrupt the language and idea of human rights. They are extremely active in the most pernicious way here in Geneva at the Human Rights Council. And what if instead of the Castro regime sitting at the United Nations, instead we had someone like Guillermo Farinas Hernandez, who gave 11 years of his life endured in prison because he dared to defy the Castro regime, who conducted 25 hunger strikes for the cause of freedom and human rights at a time when the country beats and arrests human rights defenders and opposition leaders, and was responsible for the death of Oswaldo Paya, which they've never allowed an inquiry into that. And we have Dr. Eduardo Carde in prison. What if instead of the Castro regime, we had Mr. Guillermo Hernandez representing Cuba? Today we have the right to imagine that. And we just saw the re-election of Pakistan, even as Asia Bibi, a Christian mother of 5, remains on death row for the crime of blasphemy, for having done nothing but take water from the well. And it's a country that has severe problems on women's rights and other major abuses. And there's a military establishment that controls the country. And one person who dared to defy that military establishment and who was attacked, and they tried to abduct him just in recent weeks, Mr. Taha Siddiqui. What if instead of Pakistani government and that military that controls it sitting at the Human Rights Council in that seat, we had someone like Taha Siddiqui, a brave and courageous journalist whom we all must support. And we're going to hear from many other speakers from around the world today, and they will be an inspiration. And I want to introduce now our keynote speaker to deliver the opening address and say a few words about someone who's been an inspiration. Mr. Luis Almagro is Secretary General of the Organization of American States, which comprises 35 countries from Argentina in the south to Canada in the north. He was elected in 2015 under the mandate of more rights for more people. He's a career diplomat who served as foreign minister of Uruguay from 2010 to 2015, elected to the Senate in 2014. His time at the helm of Uruguayan diplomacy was characterized by human rights activism at home and abroad, the strengthening of his country's image as an increasingly democratic, diverse, tolerant society. He was named by Foreign Policy magazine a leading global thinker. Mr. Almagro, you know, here at the United Nations, traditionally when we speak of the position of Secretary General, it is often said that it's more secretary than general. But with you, it's the opposite. In your position at the Organization of American States, you have been a general in the fight for democracy, human rights, and freedom in your hemisphere, and nowhere more than in the case of Venezuela. As that country was plunged into economic chaos and humanitarian crisis, many of its neighbors looked the other way. They proposed dialogue between the opposition and the government, ignoring the regime's blatant violations of constitutional order and its refusal to negotiate seriously. But you led the way as a remarkable exception, becoming an eloquent advocate time and again for democracy and human rights for the people of Venezuela. You stunned many by proposing that the OAS formally review that country's adherence to the Inter-American Democratic Charter, a treaty that binds OAS members to norms and provides for collective action when they are violated. Mr. Almagro, you have been a shining hope for the people of Venezuela who are long suffering, and you have been a model worldwide of moral leadership in international diplomacy. It's our honor to invite you to give today's opening address.
Human rights are not a partisan or political issue. There is no gray area when it comes to fundamental rights and freedoms. They cannot be negotiated or manipulated to achieve narrow political interest. Dear friends, it is an honor to be here with you today. I am humbled to be speaking to the audience we have in this room today. This room is filled with courageous individuals who have made personal choice and made significant personal sacrifices to fight and defend these very same protections for our fundamental human rights. This year, we commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This declaration presents a bold vision of a world where every person is born free and lives with equality in dignity and rights. It imagines a world without tyranny, without fear, without hate. The Declaration outlines a basic quality of life to which all people are entitled to their life, liberty, and security of the person, and provides people the tools to make that a reality, a world where human rights and freedom for all individuals are granted. This is not to say that we have achieved all of these things. In reality, there are still too many people in this world who are suffering from inequality and exclusion. People who do not have access to justice, who live under tyranny and are lacking protections for their basic civil, political, economic, and social rights. By outlining this clear set of rights and obligations, we have given ourselves the responsibility to work consistently and diligently to make these 30 articles a daily reality for all people. Our ethical and moral values mean nothing if we do not. I stand before you represent the Organization of American States, an institution that is grounded in its commitment to democracy and human rights. This year also marks the 70th anniversary of the American Declaration of the Rights and Duty of the Man, the foundation of our inter-American human rights system. At the same conference in 1948, the founding charter of the OAS was adopted, wherein American states proclaim the fundamental rights of the individual as their guiding principles. It goes on to declare that the true significance of American solidarity and good neighborliness can only mean the consolidation on this continent within the framework of democratic institutions, of a system of individual liberty and social justice based on respect for the essential rights of man. recognizing the essential role of democracy in guaranteeing these rights. The very notion of democracy centers on the people and views all peoples as politically equals. Therefore, each and every person is entitled to enjoy the free and full exercise of their inalienable rights and freedoms without discrimination. When I assumed the role of Secretary General, I had come to this organization with the motto of more rights for more people, inequality of opportunities, and the poverty situation of millions of inhabitants in the Western Hemisphere, especially those in vulnerable situations, have a marked impact on welfare, political stability, and democratic governance. By addressing the structural factors that condition economic and social inequalities, exclusion, poverty, and extreme poverty in the Americas, we are working to achieve more democratic, just, and equitable societies, thereby strengthening our democracies for future generations. We must strive to eliminate discrimination, injustice, and inequality in order to focus on the heart of our democracies, our people. Unfortunately, the courage to stand up for this truth and to defend democracy and human rights is not something that can be taken for granted. Those of you here today know that better than most. Silence, in many cases, means complicity. For some, it implies that they don't want voices to break the silence that provides impunity. And unfortunately, this is a trap that the international community frequently falls into. When I first spoke up against the situation in Venezuela, the world was shocked. I was criticized for my stance for drawing attention to the alarming actions to dismantle democracy in Venezuela. As Secretary General, I was accused of belligerence for denouncing the extensive human rights violation and the elimination of democratic institutions in Venezuela. I wasn't acting diplomatically, it was said. The absurdity of all this being that the so-called belligerence was not tied to the murder of hundreds of protesters, the thousands of extrajudicial killings, or the countless and needless deaths of Venezuelans as a result of man-made humanitarian crisis. The belligerence was directed, apparently and ironically, at the denunciation of these crimes. My efforts were described as inappropriate and overstepping the authority of this office, none of which was true. As Secretary General, it is my responsibility to be a champion for the rights and principles that this organization stands for. I must be a voice of those without a voice and those most discriminated against, a voice of those who suffer inequality and suffer from the lack of protection for their rights. I must be the staunchest defender of those rights. Today, the OAS is still the only multilateral organization to have spoken clearly and loudly about the crisis in Venezuela. Venezuela did not become a dictatorship overnight. It happened over many years, with one democratically elected government so desperate to cling to power that it dismantled its democratic institutions one by one. Since taking over power, Nicolás Maduro has installed a corrupt and criminal government whose only concern is consolidating their power and stealing the country's wealth. Access to basic necessities of life is controlled by political affiliation, and questioning those in power is risking your life. Maduro has eliminated the rule of law and made authoritarianism the rule, twisting the meaning of regional solidarity. The international community clung to the notion of non-intervention to justify looking the other way when this power-hungry regime eliminated the rights of their citizens. A high price has been paid to learn the cost of silence and inaction, and it is the people of Venezuela who are suffering the consequences for this silence and our loss of integrity. The hesitance to raise their voices and hold the Maduro regime to account has allowed Venezuela to deteriorate into the corrupt, authoritarian, failed state we see today. More than 12,000 citizens have been detained in Venezuela since 2014. More than 150 have been killed in protests. One of the most chilling statistics is that since 2012, there have been more than 6,300 extrajudicial killings have taken place at the hands of government agents under the ironically named Operation Freedom and Protection, an operation designed to terrorize the population. Corruption and mismanagement have led to one of the greatest self-made humanitarian crises we have experienced in the Americas. There are now massive shortages of food and medical supplies that have caused far-reaching consequences. The number of undernourished people in Venezuela has jumped by 1.3 million people in the last 2 years. Close to 5 million people can only find enough for 1 meal a day, and every day between 5 and 6 children die of malnutrition. Maternal deaths have risen by 66% because there are no medical supplies to provide some of the most basic treatments, and in 2016, 7 died every day before reaching the age of 1. The government continues to deny that there is a humanitarian crisis and has repeatedly rejected all of the international assistance, turning a blind eye to the death and destruction that their corruption has caused. All the while, widespread corruption continues, and millions upon millions of stolen dollars continue to flow in the personal bank accounts of those very people who are responsible for this crisis. All efforts for dialogue to find a peaceful solution have failed over and over and over. Instead, each time the regime has used dialogue as a smokescreen to further consolidate some aspect of their dictatorship. In 2014, Maduro consolidated his position, a new status quo where political prisoners were a reality and the branches of government were co-opted. In 2016, they eliminated the recall referendum. In 2017, they created and consolidated the illegal National Constituent Assembly. The recent failed dialogue in the Dominican Republic enabled the regime to launch their spurious presidential election. There is no legitimacy to this election. Maduro has already stolen it. The international community must use every tool available to them to bring an end to this oppression. Sanctions are the strongest diplomatic tool we have, and so I call on states to introduce more, broader and tougher sanctions against this regime. Sanctions will not hurt the people of Venezuela. It hurts the personal pocketbooks of those siphoning off money from what is left of the country's resources. The worst possible sanction for the Venezuelan people would be 6 more years of repression and dictatorship, of hunger, sickness, and the deprivation of their human rights. That is the only guarantee that Maduro brings. This government does not care about the suffering of its people. They are directly responsible for it. Venezuela has become a failed state. It is a threat to international peace and security. No member state of the OES or of the United Nations can ignore what is happening in Venezuela or be complacent about the trampling of its people's human rights. At the OES, we're using every tool available to us to help address the crisis. We have invoked the Inter-American Democratic Charter. We have created a process to analyze whether or not crimes against humanity have taken place in Venezuela. We welcome the ICC announcement opening a preliminary examination into the situation in Venezuela. The information that our team at the OES has gathered is shocking. We cannot allow this impunity to continue. Although the United Nations does not have a democratic charter, it does have 3 pillars that constitute the purposes for which that organization exists: to maintain international peace and security, development, and human rights. The greater the number of voices condemning this abhorrent dictatorship, the closer we will be to ending it and restoring Venezuelans their liberties. No democratic country can be complicit, nor can be their leaders and representatives or any multilateral forum. Silence, methodological or procedural excuses, absences, and convoluted languages are the main reasons that the Venezuelan regime is still in power. No political, legal, or economic argument can justify going along with its murderous dictatorship. A Uruguayan politician named Wilson Ferreira, who has been an inspiration to me through much of my career. When the dictatorship was about to dissolve parliament in 1973, he spoke timeless words that ring true today. It is said that tyrants and their accomplices will be judged by history, and this is true. However, before that, the people will make them accountable and responsible for their actions. In today's world, new technologies, better and broader access to education, people are becoming more and more empowered to speak their minds and demand their rights. It is imperative that governments take heed of the people's concerns and address them. The regime in Venezuela thinks that jailing the opposition, murdering their critics, closing the civic space, shutting down the media, that they can control the narrative and act with impunity. They are wrong. It is because of countless brave Venezuelans, human rights defenders and human rights freedom fighters, people that belong here in this room among us today, people like you, that we know the truth about what is happening in Venezuela. We make sure that we hold this regime to account. It is their bravery that inspires me every day to keep fighting to uphold our commitments to the rights and freedoms that we have enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man. Thank you very much.
My name is Sophia Harberger, and I am a student at École Florimond in Geneva. The empty chair on this panel is dedicated to Eduardo Cardet, a medical doctor who is a political prisoner in Cuba. Dr. Cardet is the national coordinator of the Christian Liberation Movement in Cuba, which was founded by the late dissident Oswaldo Paya. He has led projects designed to grant the right to vote to Cuban citizens. Dr. Cardet is married with 2 children and works as a family doctor in the town of Velasco. For a period, he was expelled from his work in retaliation for his opposition activity. He was also detained on several occasions. The last time he was taken prisoner by the Cuban police was on November 30th, 2016. Dr. Cardet was arrested for criticizing Fidel Castro a few days after his death. He suffered a severe beating by government agents, which continued while in detention. Dr. Cardet was sentenced to 3 years in prison on trumped-up charges. Recently, he was moved to a notorious prison in Havana and then beaten brutally. Today, we say to Dr. Cardet, we have not forgotten you.
Thank you to UN Watch for the invitation. The Human Rights Foundation, chaired by Gary Kasparov and presided by Thor Halvorsen, are very grateful for the opportunity to once again collaborate in the organization of this wonderful conference. I want to start, before I introduce our panelists, by noting that there are 2 ways in which we can learn the importance of liberty and democracy. One of them is exemplified by Thomas Jefferson's quote that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure, he said. It is its natural fertilizer. That's one way of learning about the importance of liberty and democracy. To have to fight for it, to go through horrendous circumstances after you've lost liberty and are trying to recuperate it. Another way is exemplified by the great quote of Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel that said, "We must bear witness for the dead and for the living. It is our responsibility to bear witness and to decide what to do with our memories of the deceased under a dictatorship." The second one, obviously, is the one that we are called to do here in open societies, in Switzerland, in the United States, in Canada, in most countries in Latin America today, in most countries of Western Europe, in around 20% of Africa. Everyone that has the luxury of living in a free society, in a democracy, in a country that is not ruled by an authoritarian regime, must learn from the stories of the people that are bearing witness day to day, that you have here in this conference, that you saw in the clip at the beginning. We must hear the stories. We must learn from about their stories, about their suffering, so that in our own societies we don't repeat the same mistakes. We bear witness as they are bearing witness of their own societies, and that way rid ourselves from the perils of tyranny that are prevalent in every open society. Every open society can shut down in a single generation. The four speakers that I'm going to introduce today are examples of heroes, survivors that have borne witness of their own countries' atrocities. And I wanna introduce them one by one. First though, I want to define authoritarianism by Nathan Sharansky's public square test. According to Nathan Sharansky's case for democracy, if one cannot go to the public square and freely criticize its government, one is not living in a free society. One is living in a fear society. Authoritarian regimes are, by definition, regimes where people live in fear societies, where people cannot go to the public square and criticize the government. Now, political scientists go and make more sophisticated arguments that maintain this general truth. One such political scientist is Steve Levitsky, which we follow at the Human Rights Foundation, to classify governments around the world in either dictatorship or two types of authoritarian regimes: competitive authoritarian regimes or fully authoritarian regimes, which are non-democracies. According to our count, 95 of around 193 countries in the world are authoritarian regimes, are ruled by authoritarian governments that do not pass the public square test. That is the case of Vietnam, of Zimbabwe, of Cuba, and Turkey today. Unfortunately, all four countries are considered fully authoritarian regimes, full-fledged dictatorships. Turkey was a good example of a competitive authoritarian regime. There was some degree of decent competition for power in a climate of harassment and persecution, obviously, but there was some semblance of democracy. The same with Venezuela many years ago, but both countries have transitioned into complete dictatorial regimes. We're going to hear first from Asli Erdogan. Asli comes from Turkey, 85 million people country, a country that was on the verge of becoming a full-fledged democracy and of being admitted for membership at the European Union, but that unfortunately has gone completely the opposite way. And Asli, a writer who has been herself imprisoned for being a member of an advisory board of a newspaper in Turkey. She has suffered political imprisonment, inhuman and degrading treatment in prison. And she is very eloquent, as you'll see in a minute, in explaining how horrible the situation has become and unbearable for the free world to continue watching idle how unbearable this situation has become in Turkey. After that, we're going to have Guillermo Coco Fariñas. Guillermo is a Sakharov Prize winner, the Human Rights Prize from the European Union, as you know, as well as the Venezuelan opposition, today represented by Mayor Ledesma. He won the Sakharov Prize back in the early 2000s. He is a very brave advocate for democracy. He has essentially risked his life many times by doing hunger strikes in Cuba for dozens of days. He's been on the verge of annihilation, but he has survived to tell his story, to bear witness to what happens in Cuba to his fellow dissidents, and to enlighten us all so that we don't repeat the issues that he saw in Cuba. He was a member of the dictatorship at some point. He was a military man. He fought with the dictatorship in Africa, and he's here to bear witness about his experience. Third, we're going to have Pastor Evan Mawarire. Evan is a hero from Zimbabwe, one of the worst dictatorships in Africa. After Idi Amin, who was an infamous dictator, probably Robert Mugabe became the best example of an awful tyrant that turned his country's dream for independence into a nightmare of kleptocracy and abuse and repression. He is a member of the new generation that is calling on his country for hope. This new generation that has eventually led to the overthrow of Mugabe. Unfortunately, though Zimbabwe has not transitioned into a democracy, it's still ruled by the same tyrants, and he's going to speak about that today. And finally, we're going to hear from someone that is bearing witness also on behalf of his dad, of his imprisoned father in Vietnam. Vietnam has, I believe, very little attention compared to the degree of human suffering that it inflicts on people. Vietnam has a population of close to 100 million people. And this tiny country that we in the free world know mostly because of Hollywood movies about the Vietnam War by the US, etc. This country is in fact still today oppressed. 100 million people are oppressed by a dictatorial regime there. And one of those people is Eli Gwen's dad, and he's going to speak about that in a little bit as he bears witness, and hopefully illuminates us all so that in free societies we're able to spread the message, spread the word, so that voters vote for the left or for the right every election cycle, but never vote for the dictatorial left or the dictatorial right, because the end result is very similar, and it leads to oppression, dictatorship, and tyranny. With that, I want to pass it on to Ms. Erdogan. Thank you.
Well, hello, good morning. I'm Aslı Erdoğan from Istanbul. I am currently in exile in Frankfurt. I'm only a writer, basically, of literature, an author of 9 books, translated to 19 languages, with over 24 prizes. I tell this because this actually tells more about Turkey than me. It's not to boast of my career. I have worked only for 5 years as a columnist in total. Only 5 years. 3 years in a newspaper, Radical, leftist, but still mainstream paper. back in the 90s, the good old days. And I touched, as a literary writer, the issues like the story of the victim, let's say. Let's not say issues. Story of the victim, whoever that victim is. The prisoner, the raped woman, the gay soldier. And I tried to develop a theory of anti-violence. What is violence and how can it be avoided in a system that is actually built on violence, on power? And surely in 3 years I was fired from the paper. My literary crown was taken away, given to another writer who could carry it better. And in fact, I was a subject of a social lynch, in fact, social rape campaign. Okay, then came the millennium and the democratization period of Turkey. Everything was so great. We were fastly democratizing, except that there were some murders, like Hrant Dink, an Armenian journalist, a good friend of mine, was murdered in the streets of Istanbul in 2007. Still, the case is continuing, clearly state-related. And nobody really wanted to wake up in Europe. In 2008, when I mentioned a very dangerous change in anti-terror law in to a European audience, they almost accused me, no, they did accuse me of lying. There was only one person arrested from that new law at the time I was speaking. And by the time she was freed in 8 years, there were 8,000 arrested. But still, many people wanted to believe the full democratization of Turkey. In 2013, the Gezi uprising opened some question marks, because you had to watch the police violence on us, which I still have the burn marks, from the acid the police used on civilians. But still. And in 2016, we had this so-called coup attempt. I was coincidentally in Turkey. 1 month later, my apartment was busted by 50 policemen, half of them from security forces, totally masked, and they were so big in their vests they could hardly enter into the apartment, automatic guns, and ransacked all my writing for 30 years. And didn't even let me dress. I was in shorts meanwhile, which added to the irony of this fully dressed man in the summer heat. And then taken to a police station in a cage, basically with 3 other women for 48 hours. But it was actually very good, with luxury VIP treatment for Turkish standards. The police were very gentle and respectful to me. At that time, it was only 1 month after the coup, attempted coup, and already there were 40,000 arrests. When I was arrested, in 2 days, there was a big room like that, people sitting on the grounds. There were no more enough handcuffs, so their hands were tied. Assembly line of arrests. Every minute someone was arrested. They were all soldiers, hundreds, thousands maybe. And I was arrested by a judge almost half my age, because 2,500 judges were in jail at that time. So they had to recruit those new people who could hardly, sorry to say, speak even Turkish. And the prosecutor was quite apologetic and made for sure that I understand I'm arrested from the orders from the very top. So what was I arrested for? I was on the advisory board of a little newspaper, Özgür Gündem. It's pro-Kurdish newspaper. It has many cases against it, but it is perfectly legal, which pays its tax every month. And the advisory board was, we were invited 5 years ago, totally symbolic names. A literary writer, a linguist, 70 years old, she was in jail with me, an ecologist, a publisher who was nominated for Nobel Peace Prize in the year 2012, Ragıp Zarakolu, and the founder of a socialist party, a feminist journalist, and one parliamentary from HDP, the pro-Kurdish party. This was the symbolic board. And all those 5 years, there were hundreds of cases against the newspaper, but none of it was reflected to us because press law is very clear. For all published material, either the author, if it's anonymous, the editor-in-chief is responsible. No advisor had ever been arrested in Turkey before me. I'm the first. I mean, I advise, I don't execute. The name is very clear. It was completely against law. And what was I accused with? 302, the heaviest article in the Turkish court, destruction of the unity of the state, which is what Öcalan is sentenced from, and it was death sentence until 1999. So in fact, I am the only female literary writer in the Turkish history who was more or less asked a death sentence. The death sentence might come back any moment in Turkey. Then that will be the sentence they are asking for me. And for 5 of us, the ecologist, the linguist, whose average age is 70, the publisher, and you know why not 6? The HDP parliamentary, they didn't even open charges against him. It was such a Kafkaesque case, if it is not an insult to Kafka. And ours was and only out of these 5, 2 were arrested, me and the 70-year-old linguist, Necmiye Alpay. We were in the same prison. And 2 weeks later, again, another Kafkaesque indictment became a joke on the papers. A renowned Turkish novelist and very important columnist, Ahmet Altan, was accused of giving subliminal messages on TV. Just because one day before the coup attempt, he was on TV and criticized the government. And they said, you are giving subliminal messages to promote the coup attempt. And unlike me, he was not released in the first court hearing. And 2 days ago, he was sentenced for aggravated life sentence. He will spend the rest of his life in a cell, along with 5 other people. I'm just telling you 2 stories out of tens of thousands. The real numbers are very high. When I was arrested, it was already 40,000 back in August 2016. And it never went below 1,000 per week. The number 55,000 is a big lie. The real number is around 100 to 150,000. You can look at the number of statistics they have to publish each week, number of arrests and releases. The prisons are by far overfull, 280,000. It was 170,000 before the coup attempt, and there were many releases of common criminals, so they could make room for us. There are many reports of physical torture. By the way, these numbers, 100,000, 150,000, they sound small to you, I know. But when the Second World War started, in the whole concentration camps, there were 40,000 people. And I compare Turkey to concentration camp because only on one basis, that we were arrested not by a judge, but by orders of authorities that we never know. That is the difference between a jail and a concentration camp. A judge sends you to jail, police or SS or SA or whatever high that you don't mention sends you to a camp. Even if it's a 5-star hotel, it's a concentration camp. And I'm still facing this so-called theater trial on 6th of March. And I don't know, maybe for being an advisor to a totally legal paper. By the way, none of the journalists were arrested, and the paper is still published even without another name. So I could read it in prison, in fact. It is so legal, I could read the paper in prison on 6th of March. And I would like you to have a look at these numbers and why does, for example, Pan International say, we have never faced a situation like this in our entire history, which includes the Nazi regime and the Stalin era. No journalists and writers were arrested at such mass quantities like today's Turkey. I think I'm out of time. And not only writers, journalists, parliamentarians are in jail, mayors are there, doctors were taken under custody, lawyers, and thousands of students and people who have no big names or no important professions or so the situation is very grave, and it gets more and more grave as the silence of the international community deepens. Thank you very much.
Señores que presiden la cumbre.
Ladies and gentlemen, attending the 2018 Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy, fighters for freedom and human rights from all over the world, distinguished guests, and participants of the summit, non-government organizations. I would like to start by conveying special thanks to my sponsors from the United Nations Watch, who have brought me here today. Everyone's asking one question. Why did I become anti-Castro? Following my ideals, why am I willing to give up my life to defend representative democracy? And why am I right to denounce every day the cruelty of the political system that I face? These questions can be answered from my own social and political background, because I'm the son of two warriors who fought against the tyranny of Batista, my father, Guillermo Fariñas-Kay, who has already passed away, and my mother, Alicia Hernández Cabeza. Both of them fought against the same tyranny that Fidel Castro and his followers from the 26th of July movement had once fought against. My parents joined the revolutionary movement and fought on different fronts in favor of Castro. My father even fought in the Belgian Congo alongside Che Guevara in '65. And my mother was an international nurse in Algeria in 1973. Thus, the person speaking to you here today is a so-called new man, but a democrat and not an autocrat. I was a naive and convinced castrist until April 1980. Then, when I was in the military as a pre-cadet, I was mobilized to Havana to stabilize the country, because some 3 million Cubans wanted to flee the hell that my homeland had become. The Embassy of Peru in Havana granted diplomatic protection to people, eventually allowing some 130,000 Cubans to leave the country through the port of Mariel. I stood watch over a packed Peruvian embassy, but even with my provincial mindset, I asked myself, with fear of being caught, what is going on in Cuba that so many people want to go to a foreign and unknown country? To be honest, for months I had been incapable of asking myself that question because I was terrified of the obvious response. I was afraid that one of my fellow soldiers would guess what I was thinking. Those doubts, even though very internal and secret, were my first acts of dissidence, for I remind you I was just 18 years old. My second act of dissidence, which was also secret, took place during a war between the jungle and the bedsheets of Angola. There I observed how the villages of Angolan peasants were being raided by the anti-guerrilla Cuban troops of the Fuente Olivo. There I saw death caused by my peers as something necessary. I saw how men were the murderers of their fellow men. I witnessed the fiercest form of hatred I had ever seen in my life. Although my task in Angola did not involve killing people. I had to blow up bridges. I was part of the barbarism that communism brought to these places. Now, every time that I talk to an Angolan studying in my country, I apologize for what we Cubans did there. I have to make something clear. The Cubans who dared to defy orders in Angola, considering them to be inhuman, were summarily executed, and their families were told that they had fallen in combat. It was my third dissident act that turned me into the anti-communist that I am today. Paradoxically, this happened at a Russian military academy in the Russian city of Tambov, where I was living alongside the inhabitants of the region. There I saw the cruelty of communism close up. I learned about the execution of the family of Tsar Nicholas II, including the children and the women. I read Animal Farm. I heard about the women who were raped and about entire families being sent to gulags. From my father was told about my disappointment, and I was surprised to find out that my father also was disappointed politically. He asked me to study, so I got a degree in psychology in this. And I didn't leave. I had been presented before with an award in Angola, and that's why they didn't kick me out of the university, because otherwise I would have been. I am known in the media now for my 25 hunger strikes, above all. In one of the hunger strikes, we have not, in some of them, we haven't been successful. In others, we were successful. But many prisoners were able to leave because of our hunger strikes. By carrying out a hunger strike, I defied the experienced and sophisticated repression of the dictatorship. I am encouraging Cubans to fight. They have used different repressive methods against me in the 30 years that I've been fighting. And they've been fighting against the ideas of my democratic brothers. They've tried to paint me as a despicable whistleblower of my fellow countrymen's democratic ideals. When they realized that this wasn't possible, they tried to jail me, which they've done on 3 occasions. My repressors saw that each attention was only strengthening my resolve, so they discouraged me. And they've set people to attack me and discourage me. The repression against me right now is focused on trying to delegitimize me nationally, internationally. And for that purpose, they flooded the social media with false information, hoping that my struggle and what Cubans like me have done will not succeed historically. Please, don't be deceived by the supposed changes in my country. After the death of Castro, there will be the departure of his brother Raúl as president. But in Cuba, people are not free to choose their president, and they are further away from having the choice between different political options. So from this podium, I therefore ask you to show solidarity with the Cuban people, because international denunciation and pressure are what will make things change there, together with our fight to achieve freedom and representative democracy. We must consider our fight. And we have hundreds of political prisons, more than 118. The people in my country have an autocratic mentality in their negotiations. And that people do not think of the well-being of the citizens, they only think about control, and they require complicity. And therefore, we have to fight internationally, not only nationally. So think about Cuba, please. And think about Venezuela above all. Martí said, our homeland is humanity. Many people say that the devil is in Venezuela, but his head is in Cuba. We must recognize that Luis Armado, who spoke today, has done a great work, and we must recognize what he has done. He has been able to put above his own ideas the need for democratic change. And we are fighting a war in Latin America, and we must also fight in the Mideast. We must recognize political integrity. We must not cave in to dictatorships, because the freedom of Cuba will require the freedom of Venezuela as well. Many Democratic friends have asked, how is it that I have the strength and the courage to continue fighting despite what's happening? And I answer, it comes from my love for Cuba and love for democracy. I am fighting to free humanity and people, and this will only end when I die. This is an ongoing struggle. I want to see Cuba free and democratic, and this idea inspires me on a day-to-day basis to continue my struggle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Today in Zimbabwe, an amazing man who began a journey for democracy and the rights of Zimbabweans that many of us in Zimbabwe never thought possible, that man is being laid to rest today. Morgan Tsvangirai is a hero for all Zimbabweans. And as a young man, I watched him from afar and only put into practice in the last 2 years that it is possible to stand up to brutality and injustice as an ordinary person and see a change in our nation. I would like to ask you today, Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy, to allow me a moment's silence as they lay him to rest in a little village in Buhera in rural Zimbabwe, to honor this man's life and his contribution for the many Zimbabweans that seek freedom today. Thank you. On the 19th of April 2016, a day after Independence Day in Zimbabwe, I sat in my small church office, disappointed and upset at what Zimbabwe had done to me as a person. Our government had stripped me of any sense of chance of living safely and prosperously in the place that I have the right to call home. As an ordinary citizen and pastor of a small church, I had no options to remedy the sorry state that Zimbabwe had become. What remained that millions had done was to leave the country. So I sat up and used two simple things that I had in that very moment: my phone and my voice. It was my last-ditch effort and a call to my countrymen to save our country. I posted that first video entitled #ThisFlag on Facebook, talking about how our government had taken us for granted, broken our constitution, and robbed our future. I spoke about how it was now our job as ordinary citizens to reclaim the pride of our nation as reflected in the emblems of our national flag. That video and many others after that cracked open a journey in the rise of citizen power that no one expected to see under the brutal dictatorship of Robert Mugabe. A movement of citizens standing up against corruption, injustice, and poverty was born. This Flag Citizens movement was and still is about holding government to account through the citizen's voice. This voice had been silenced for over 37 years through intimidation, abductions, murders, political violence, economic exclusion, and state capture. Our mantra was, if we cannot cause the politician to change, then we must inspire the citizen to be bold. I was first arrested on the 12th of July 2016 after helping to organize a national shutdown. We refused to go to work, to school, or open our businesses as a way of sending a message to the regime that we were no longer afraid of them and that we no longer tolerated their misrule. I was charged with subversion and accused of attempting to overthrow the government. I faced up to 20 years in prison. My pregnant wife and my 2 infant daughters were threatened with rape and death whilst I was in prison. I was interrogated, threatened with torture, and if I did not disclose who was funding me or if I vowed to continue. After a lengthy and dramatic court hearing, the courts had to let me go because the arrest had violated my constitutional rights. But the greatest victory that day was not the court's decision. It was the thousands of citizens who gathered at the courts from morning until night, demanding my release. We had not seen this kind of mass boldness in a long time. Upon my release, I immediately fled the country under the cover of darkness through a small border. There was a plan to abduct, torture, or rearrest me. My family too was in grave danger, so I had them taken out of Zimbabwe to a safer place. President Robert Mugabe was in the habit of threatening people personally, and he did that to me as well. He promised that there was no place in Zimbabwe for people like me except specially prepared jails, which I would later experience in my journey. He threatened pastors, he threatened ordinary citizens who had rallied with me in the protest. For close to 6 months, I lived in exile, unsure whether going back would be strengthening of the citizen power or it would be the demise of the little hope that we had garnered. You see, hope is the only thing that has kept Zimbabweans going. When we have lost every opportunity, when we have lost sometimes even the willpower to carry on, we have always maintained that we have hope that our nation will somehow change. We had hoped that one day we would find it within ourselves to respect our children's future enough by standing up today. On the 1st of February 2017, I returned to Zimbabwe and I was immediately arrested at the airport. I was charged with subversion for the events that I had escaped from in the previous year. And additionally, I was also charged with attempting to throw the government for a protest which I had led with fellow Zimbabweans at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. I was thrown into the notorious Chikurubi maximum security prison along with convicts of crimes ranging for rape, armed robbery, and murder. The harassment was unbearable, but I had no choice but to face it and survive it. Out on bail, I began yet another journey of more arrests, intimidations, torture, and harassment that lasted 11 months. My passport was taken away from me, and I had to report to the police twice a week for a whole year. I was arrested and imprisoned again for praying with university medical students who were protesting poor learning conditions. I was arrested yet again whilst in the middle of a sermon on Sunday at church for posting a video on Facebook in which I spoke about the shortage of fuel and the increase of basic food prices. Why did I start this? Why did I come back? Why did I continue, you may ask? You see, I found out something after that first video and after that subsequent arrest. I found out that there is no one who brings a fight for Zimbabwe that is sustainable and passionate than a Zimbabwean. There are no heroes coming to save us except ourselves. What we needed was to find that courage to stand for ourselves. I came back to Zimbabwe because it was time to model a Zimbabwean who refuses to run, who rejects intimidation and demands that their voice be heard. And it was worth it. It was worth it because you cannot put a price tag on restored dignity and true freedom. We had longed for Mugabe to just die away, but that would have robbed us of something even better. You see, our expectation of a better Zimbabwe and a better nation was not in the hope that our oppressor would die, but that whilst he lived, we stood up to him. On November 18, 2017, Zimbabweans took an opportunity to confront Robert Mugabe's rule. We stood together in a powerful act of unity and demanded a new start. It was unthinkable that we did what we never thought we would see in our lifetime. We had to play our part and send a message to both Mugabe and future leaders that we had found our voice. On 29 November 2017, after 17 months of arrests, jail time, court appearances, and intimidations, the High Court of Zimbabwe ruled that due to a lack of evidence, I was not guilty of the charges of subversion and the many charges of inciting public violence and the attempt to overthrow our government. It has been said by our new president, who was also part of Mugabe's regime, that Zimbabwe is open for business. However, the question that must be asked is Zimbabwe open for freedom? What we have discovered is that the citizens must never accept a government that muzzles their voice, brutalizes us, and subverts our will. It is not enough to promise free and fair elections. There must be the corresponding enactment and observance of the laws that guarantee freedom and diversity. We ask you to take note of the culture of violence, oppression, and denial of fundamental constitutional rights that has been the culture of the past. It must not continue to happen in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe cannot go into the future with money for business only. She must walk confidently into tomorrow with real freedom for her people too. That is why I choose to continue till today to speak truth to power and never, ever be cowed into silence again. Long live the freedom of the voice of the Zimbabwean citizen. May God bless you. Thank you. You want me to raise that? Oops, upside down. You want me to hold it up? Yeah? That way, yeah. Thank you. This way? Yeah? There we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. Mr. Wen.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my story with you. My name is Nguyen Trung Trọng Nghĩa. I'm a Vietnamese national, and I'm here to tell you a story of the religious leaders, human rights defenders, and the whole independent civil society of Vietnam. This is the story of the bravest man I have ever known. He has been a church minister, a human rights activist, and above all, he was my father. He was my dad. Well, you can say that I'm somehow biased. Yes, however, perhaps it was because I was there seeing him when hundreds of people stormed into our house, cornered him up, and demand that he must kneel down and apologize or face a certain death. And in that moment, I saw my dad. I was a little boy, and my dad, with a bloody face and tearful eyes, was like saying, I shall never bow down before any man, and I will never abandon my faith in God. In 2006, when the church was under a tremendous amount of persecution with a lot of pressure of death threats, upon receiving an offer from the US Embassy to seek asylum, my dad was thinking about it for a while, and then he answered, I cannot forsake my church at this moment. If I leave, who will be there to lead and defend them? So earlier, in January 2011, my dad, Pastor Nguyen Trung Thon, was taken away from us and imprisoned for 2 years. The Vietnamese authorities charged him with propaganda against the state, while everything he ever did was to write articles questioning the communist form national history of the Vietnam War and raising his voice about the human rights violations of our government. During the dark time in prison, he was still able to deliver us the hope through his poems, sending to my mother as a love letter. He said, "The letter I write in the communist dictatorial prison, longing to see you in the light of democracy." Upon his release in 2013, my father went home, continued his human rights work, and of course, got persecuted many times again. In that same year, he partnered up with other former prisoners of conscience such as Nguyen Van Dai and Pham Van Choi to form up an organization called the Brotherhood for Democracy. The aim of the organization is to advocate for democracy and human rights in Vietnam through civic education and civil society volunteer work. On the evening of February 27, 2017, which is last year, my father was abducted by a group of 8 men while trying to reach Concha Parish, where many victims of land grabbings needed his organization's help. This group of men took off his clothes, belongings in a car, covered his head, and repeatedly beating him up with iron bars while he was tied up. Eventually, after 3 hours of beating my father, they tossed him out in a cold, remote jungle to die. Naked, tied up, and broken. Fortunately, with the help of some local people, my father was able to escape. He survived, but the damage was internal and severe. 5 months after his abduction, he has a broken knees and trouble heavy breathing. My dad cried to me when he called me on the phone saying, it hurts, son, it hurts so badly. In fact, his health was in such a poor condition that he felt like he was going to die soon. He told me, "Son, do not be troubled, that once you return home and you're not being able to see me, just continue your fight for Vietnam's freedom." These are the few last words I ever heard from my dad before he was arrested again on July the 30th, 2017, on the charges of attempting to overthrow the state. And it was just 5 months after his abduction. While my dad is in jail without any communication to my family, the police continue to harass my mother, ignoring the fact that my mom has to take care of the broken family with my old and blind grandmother and 2 of my siblings who are minors. Police keep on summoning her for interrogation. Last year, when my sister was rushed to a hospital for urgent blood transfusion because of some psychological depression caused by social pressure on my family and my father's dire situation. And fortunately, good people over the country donated money to help my mother shower the hospital fees. However, the police interrogated and threatened my mother, saying she received the money from the terrorist. My mother denied the outrageous accusation, which led the authority to shut down her bank account. Luckily, with such a lot of social and international pressure, my mother was able to recover the account. While in jail, my father has been denied a lawyer, and it was just only a few weeks ago, after 6 months, my mother was able to meet my dad. Everybody bursted out in tears as my little brother, 10-year-old, started crying because he sees dad. My mom couldn't hold her tears, thinking of what had been happening for my family over the past 16 years. Ever since, we started to be different Ever since we started to fight for what is right, and ever since we started to say enough is enough. Our country must be run by a rule of law, not the police. And human rights must be the foundation of a humane society. Dear my fellow participants on the Geneva Summit, I urge you to please raise your voice as a human rights defender to exert effort on Vietnam authority through every international mechanism possible. The United Nations Periodic Review, the United Nations Universal Periodic Review should bring up cases like this, so the Vietnamese government cannot lie anymore. They cannot persecute patriots and human rights defenders and still expect to be welcomed by the international community. Please save my father, who exhausted his mind and body for the cause of freedom and democracy. Please save my mother, a political prisoner's wife who struggled to sustain the family, a family that is not only suffering. My family is not the only one suffering from this flight. There are hundreds of other families like us in Vietnam who need your help. Within the Brotherhood for Democracy alone, at least 13 people are arbitrarily detained, including Nguyễn Văn Đài, Phạm Văn Choi, and Trương Minh Đức. Other peaceful activists such as Nguyễn Văn Oai, Hoàng Đức Bình, and Nguyễn Văn Hóa has been unfairly sentenced to jail by a kangaroo court in Vietnam. Innocent children are deprived of their parents. Elderly parents are deprived of their children. Husbands and wives are separated for years. Breaking up the families and community has caused a huge injustice with a tremendous consequence for the society. At this summit, I see men and women with great courage and relentless compassion. And I pray that all of you may never get tired of fighting. Because this fight for human rights is a good fight. May the values of liberty shine up upon the world in this troubling moment. And this is a very moment for us who are human beings to stand up and say, time is up. The authorities' lies and abuses have to stop. Universal human rights must be upheld. Dedicated men and women who stand up for this valuable and honorable principle deserve to be protected. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Wen. We're a little behind schedule, so we're not going to be doing a round of questions. So the final thing would be, please, let's give a final big round of applause to these heroes. From Cuba, Coco Fariñas, Asli Erdogan from Turkey, Eva Mallory from Zimbabwe, and Mr. Wen from Vietnam. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I am Yavuz Baydar, Chief Editor of newly launched ahvalnews.com, trilingual online news site about Turkey in Arabic, Turkish and English, in case you are interested in checking that out. We, the journalists, are more than ever before alienated, demonized, targeted, threatened, forced to expect the worst. This is the evil and contagious spirit of the current times on the planet. And we feel less protected, less shielded, less safeguarded by our universal and constitutional rights than ever before. Seen as the enemy by the world's growing number of autocrats, supreme leaders, despots, Führers, and their lackeys and their sycophants, we are more fragile and vulnerable than ever before. The more we are exposed to such diabolic ways of oppression, the very profession of ours, of course, is endangered. This is a trend that we see in many corners of the world these days. In Turkey, we have, as many of you know, the lion's share of that trend. There are a variety of ways to annihilate journalism, as we see many different punitive exercises in our country. The mildest stage of the punitive measures is sackings of dignified journalists, regardless of their political inclination and color, who resist in the name of basic standards of journalism, by the media proprietors who are in alliance with corrupt political leaderships in order to benefit from a corrupt order. The second grade is filing charges with imprisonment. Arrests and detentions come next at the third stage. Beatings and torture, harassment, that too. That method targets in Turkey primarily our Kurdish colleagues, the boldest segment in Turkey's rapidly ailing journalism. It was the dead of a December night in 2016, some months after the attempted coup in Turkey, when masked special ops units barged into the apartment of Ömer and Tülay Yerçelik in Diyarbakır, in Turkey's mainly Kurdish southeast. For the next 2 hours, Mrs. Yerçelik, her month-old son, and her mother-in-law had to listen as the agents beat severely her husband, Ömer, in the next room. The violence ended only when the police arrived. Mr. Çelik, a journalist for the pro-Kurdish Dicle Haber Agency, one of over 150 news outlets shut down since the abortive coup, was detained later in Diyarbakır for 2 weeks. He was then transferred to a maximum security prison near Istanbul, where he remains. His crime, according to an indictment that appeared only in late June last year, it was to have published news stories based on the hacked emails of Turkey's energy minister, who is the son-in-law of the president of Turkey. He faces a sentence of 16 years. In terms of the length of the prison charges, you may still say he's lucky. This is mild by comparison to other cases. The final stage of punishment in Turkey, where the state of emergency since the attempted coup seems ad infinitum, infinite, delivering savage prison sentences to critical journalists and dissidents. Last Friday, a court in Turkey sentenced 3 senior prominent journalists, along with 3 others, younger ones, to aggravated lifetime imprisonment for, through a TV studio chat and a few opinion articles, inciting the coup by sending out quote-unquote subliminal messages in that direction. Of the 3, Ahmet Altan, a former chief editor of the anti-militarist daily Taraf, no longer existing, and his brother, economist and columnist Mehmet, and the third one, the host of the very TV show, 73-year-old lady, Nazlı Ilıcak. What united these was their staunch pro-democracy views and their ferocious intellectual activity against all the authoritarian political engineering stances in Turkish politics throughout the decades. Aggravated lifetime sentence. What does it mean? It means that they will have to spend the rest of their lives in prison without a parole, in solitary confinement, 23 hours per day, being given a right to meet a close relative twice a month. No other contacts with other prisoners are allowed in 30 years. This is as far as it gets. The sentences display a powerful trend that we now can speak of, what in German is called Feindstrafrecht, the law against the enemy, relatively new term coined by German law expert Günther Jacobs. Now we can talk about dehumanization of dissidents, like in Soviet Union or Germany in 1930s. Hatred and grudge know no boundaries. What's probably worse is that these sentences are signal flares for similar punishments in the coming trials for two newspapers, Daily Cumhuriyet and Daily Zaman, now banned, trials in which staunchly pro-democracy colleagues, elderly, many of them in frail health, face extremely long-term imprisonments, simply for reporting freely and expressing dissent to arbitrary power. Journalism is not a crime, but life for journalists elsewhere in countries eclipsed by intolerance is not easier. Not at all. Only weeks ago, a bold colleague of ours barely survived an abduction and possible execution attack in Pakistan. He was simply lucky. He is 33 years old, an award-winning investigative journalist, both in print and visual media. He covered Pakistan for a dozen years. He operated, I would say, in Islamabad and reported for New York Times, The Guardian, and France 24. Later, his coverage extended to Afghanistan, including documentaries. One documentary on polio in the region, in these two countries, brought him the Albert Londres Prize, which is the most prestigious media award in France, compared to Pulitzer of France. He continued to cover terrorism, violence, minorities, and subject, equally as taboo in Turkey as in Pakistan, civilian-military relations, which exposed him as a renowned critic of Pakistani military. Most recently, he was forced to leave his country. He now lives in Paris, France. His case was covered by the French media extensively, and he feels he has to live in exile, having to find a job to make a living for himself and for his family in Europe. Now he is here in Geneva with us to tell his dramatic story and beyond. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, from Pakistan, a brave journalist, indefatigable with his professional exercise, Mr. Taha Siddiqui.
Thank you all for being here, and especially the United Nations Watch for this opportunity. When I told my parents I was being invited to the United Nations Watch to speak about the authorities' attempt to abduct me, they strongly advised against it. A friend warned that by coming here and speaking today, I was being loud, and Pakistani authorities do not like loud people. Another colleague said that I should be careful because at the end of the day, I have to live in Pakistan. All this is true, but I have one response. I am doing this for all of us. I tell my family, friends, and colleagues that recently they came for me. Tomorrow they may come for any of you, and it will continue until one day there is no one left to speak the truth. But before that happens, I want to ensure that I did everything in my power to fight for our right of freedom of speech. To an outsider, it may seem that there is democracy in Pakistan and civilian government is in charge, but it's sort of a facade because the military really runs the power and runs sort of a shadow government. It may also seem that the media in Pakistan is quite vibrant and independent, especially because it has sort of freedom when it comes to reporting on government and political parties. But if you scratch the surface, you will discover that taboo topics, there are taboo topics, and self-censorship is the norm. Such taboo subjects include the Pakistan military and religion, particularly Islam. Challenges of these topics rarely survive be it an individual or a news organization. Over 100 Pakistani journalists have been killed in Pakistan in the last 15 years. Dozens more have been beaten, kidnapped, or threatened into silence. While there are non-state threats, they're usually linked to state apparatus in some way. For example, when Geo News, Pakistan's leading news channel, accused the intelligence services of orchestrating an attack on one of its journalists, the channel was forcibly closed down on blasphemy charges, and a religious lobby was activated to punish the network. Pakistan's army mostly uses intimidation tactics to silence the press. They also use financial incentives to motivate news organizations. Thus, news organizations constantly run propaganda fed to them by the military, including songs, videos, and news. All this has created a militarized society that the army then uses for its strategic purposes, for example, to justify its own expensive presence or interference in matters which they should not be involved in, for example, domestic politics or regional conflicts. For the last 12 years, I have been reporting on military affairs, including military human rights abuses, the business empire they run, and the political manipulations they're involved in. The running joke amongst my friends back at home in Islamabad was that they would take a photo with me in usual social gatherings and say that perhaps this was the last time this photo was being taken with me. And finally, in May 2017, my fears were realized when the Pakistan's Federal Investigation Agency ordered my arrest over charges they've yet to inform me about. Insiders tell me that Pakistan Army's intelligence agency is behind this move. I thus approached the court through the late Asma Jahangir, who offered to fight my case. The courts ordered the agency to back down, and I resumed my work. But the courts did not stop them. On 10th January, just about 6 weeks ago, I was on my way to the airport in Islamabad when armed men stopped my taxi and tried to take me away. I would have gone missing if I had not escaped. But given the presence of mind I had at that time and their mistake, I jumped out of an unlocked door and ran for my life, managing to get to a nearby police station. The police have failed to find a single trace of my would-be abductors, who stole my passport, my electronic equipment, and other belongings. The cameras in the area were not working, except for the taxi driver who was taking me to the airport and a girl on her way to her university. No one has come forward as an eyewitness, even though this happened in broad daylight on one of the main highways of Islamabad at 8:30 a.m. in the morning. The day it happened, after that, I filed a police case, and I told my investigation officers that I will see them soon whenever the culprits are caught. And they just laughed at my face. The police in charge in Islamabad say that those who tried to take me away were quite intelligent, as they left no clues. I told them that the word he's looking for is not intelligent, but intelligence agencies. Just before my failed abduction, I was in the city of Lahore, where a peace activist, Raza Khan, had gone missing, and another journalist, Zeenat Shehzadi, who had been missing for 2 years, had recently returned but disappeared from public. I was investigating both these cases and had conducted interviews, but my attackers took away all the material that I was to send that day to my head office for broadcasting. For over 2 months now, Raza has been missing, and his only crime was bringing Pakistani and Indian youth together on a platform called Aghaaz-e-Dosti, which means start of friendship. In the last year alone, dozens of similar cases have been reported where journalists, activists, and social media users have been beaten up or picked up from central Pakistan, from mainstream Pakistan, unlike previous cases which were reported from Balochistan province or from the tribal belt. In many countries, such dissidents are imprisoned. In Pakistan, they go missing, and they are even denied the recognition of being political prisoners. The common theme among all these cases is that the victims were vocal about issues that the military wants to control. For example, Pakistan-India relations, military policy of security in the country, the military's role beyond its mandate in areas like politics and business. And in response to our words that can never harm anyone, they have tried to silence us with violence. I have chosen the pen as my weapon, and they have responded with guns. I truly believe that evil does not prevail, and I have done nothing wrong but to exercise my freedom of speech. It is this conviction that makes me continue to, that motivates me, and I have temporarily relocated myself to Europe because of safety concerns, and I'm living with my family in Paris nowadays, but without a proper job and without a proper home. I packed my bags, and living out of a suitcase is not easy, but I decided that there was no way I was going to compromise on my freedom of speech, and hence I could temporarily compromise on my residence in Pakistan. And therefore, I have been currently living in exile since the last week and do not know when it will be safe to return back. Nevertheless, I will ensure that I will continue to raise a voice for the rights of Pakistani public, and that is why I am here today. I urge fellow diplomats, officials, and activists here who believe in the same values I do to call out the Pakistan Army. Following my attack, the US government was the only government to issue condemnation publicly. Pakistan has many international partners, and especially they have economic and trade relations with them. It is time that foreign countries should not put their values at the expense of their monetary interests. It is time that together we dissidents from inside the country and you from outside the country can pressure the military to stop such practices which have no place in a pluralistic, democratic, and progressive Pakistan that we all want to see. Thank you.
My name is Sophia Harberger, and I am a student at École Florimond in Geneva. The empty chair on this panel is dedicated to Wang Bingzhang, one of China's longest-serving political prisoners. Mr. Wang is 70 years old and in poor health. He has been locked up since 2002, when Chinese agents illegally kidnapped him from Vietnam and smuggled him across the border into jail in China. They kept him incommunicado for 6 months and then conducted a closed-door trial that lasted only 1 day. It was held without notice to family or friends. He was sentenced to life in prison. Mr. Wang's crime? As a young man, he founded China's overseas democracy movement. A medical doctor educated in the West, he devoted his life to what he believed were basic freedoms long overdue to the Chinese people. For 20 years, he lived and worked out of New York. He started a dissident magazine, founded several opposition organizations, and traveled the world, giving speeches to inspire others to share his ideals. He argued that freedom is not just a Western value, but a desire and a right of all human beings. Because he dared to speak out for freedom, China has locked up Mr. Wang and prevented him from communicating with his family who live in Canada and with the world. Today, we say to Mr. Wang, the world has not forgotten you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have spoken several times in the past at this summit about China's utter disregard for the human rights of the Chinese, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Southern Mongolians, and other ethnic, religious, and regional groups, and about its relentless crackdown on human rights defenders, lawyers, and ordinary citizens who attempt to redress for human rights violations. China squashes them all, despite the government's rhetoric about how human rights are protected by the Chinese Constitution, along with many other laws and regulations. In the latest example, in mid-January 2018, a Beijing-based human rights lawyer, Yu Wenshen, while walking his son to school, was seized by more than 12 police officers. This is Mr. Yu.